Has anyone here ever been a soldier fighting against the US? What was it like? My grandfather was conscripted to fight for the North Korean military during the Korean War. He was at the Battle of Incheon, and he likened the dread that he felt to what one must feel when faced with a massive tidal wave that is about to engulf you and everyone you know. Couple this with the fact that many North Korean troops were told horror stories, that the American troops were cannibals, for example, and that the average American Marine was much taller and more physically robust than the average North Korean soldier, you can imagine how scared he was. He said that the Chinese and North Korean units were absolutely obliterated, and that they never stood a chance against the Marines. All his words, not mine.
We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description.
Story 2. I'm an American soldier, so I'm not what you're looking for, but I'm guessing you won't find much on here. So I'll give you an analogy from some evasion training I got when getting ready for less visible operations. We were learning how to escape if you're being chased, and one of the things we trained for was trackers using dogs. The dog handlers explained it like this. Look, the dogs we use are so good at what they do, so perceptive, that they will find you. You won't be able to fool that dog. So you need to fool the handler. Travel in erratic patterns, backtrack. Make it seem to the handler that the dog has lost the scent and is just wandering. You can't beat the dog, but you might be able to beat the man. That is what fighting the US military is like. If the man behind the dog has decided you're the enemy, you've already lost. There are many, many brave fighters out there, on our side and against us. But when it comes down to it, we are going to win in a direct fight. Sure, bad things happen and we lose a battle here and there, but in a war, we will win. The trouble is that the world is learning. No one wants to fight us in a war anymore. They don't go after the dog, they go after the man behind the dog. Jack up the cost of the conflict, cause civilian casualties, force us into lose-lose situations, and our support crumbles. Then our handlers say, okay boys, we're not finding him today. Let's go home. Story 3. I was just a 7-year-old kid when my parents were watching CNN/BBC while I was playing video games. It was talking about some army jets taking off during the night. My dad turned to me and said something along the lines of, "It has begun. Get to the basement now." Sometime later, the first explosions could be heard. The NATO-US bombing of Serbia in '99 had started. I remember spending time in the basement with other residents. I remember how the building shook when the bombs exploded. The fear of what was coming after the sirens went off. They destroyed all 3 bridges across the Danube in my city, cutting us off from a part of our family. One day, a bomb hit the refinery, so we couldn't stay in the basements anymore because of CO2. Then a bomb hit about 100 meters from our building, and shrapnel went through the blinds and windows and embedded itself into the opposite wall of our neighbor's flat. That was when we decided to move somewhere where the Americans had nothing to aim for, a smaller town. We were safer there, but we could still hear the jets flying above us and bombs going off in the distance. When someone shot down the F-117 stealth jet, it was a huge hell yeah moment for Serbia. That's my short story of surviving a war versus USA. I personally just hate hearing about stuff like this. These were civilians that had absolutely no hand in the war, and yet they had to fear for their lives every day because at any point a bomb could drop and either hit them or shrapnel, and it's just terrible. It's just horrifying. Story 4. Hopefully this won't get buried, but my hopes are not too high. My father was a sniper during the bombardment of Yugoslavia, and my best friend's father was a member of the elite unit called Tigers, while the war in Kosovo was raging. I'll be short because I have to sleep, but my father told me it was like trying to repel a wave on the beach by building a castle out of sand. You fought, and you may have won some small encounters, be it by accident or pure luck, but you always knew that if they wanted to, they could just wipe everyone out and be done with it. Not a nice time for Yugoslavia, that's for sure. Story 5. I was in Kosovo during the war. My sister almost got unalived by a Serbian sniper. Like I said in another comment, that's how the KLA felt against the Serbian military. I don't think it was as bad as the US, but Serbia was fighting farmers with AKs. My dad was never with us, and I was scared I would never see him again. Some of my cousins died fighting, and others never returned from prison camps. We would hear horrible stories about Serbian soldiers and how they were animals. When we were marching across the border to Macedonia, some of the soldiers would give us food and tell us that they were sorry for what we were going through. It was surreal and we didn't trust them. We actually threw the food away because we thought it was poisoned, even though we were starving. Now I realize that they were just trying to stop the suffering, I guess. Yugoslavia may have been bad, but it was nothing compared to time in Kosovo during the war. Story 6. I'm actually former US Army. I spent an entire summer serving as an OP-4 at one of the Army's elite training centers. Basically, I fought US soldiers in a giant simulation. I'd actually agreed to some extent with the pushover comments for some units. The US Army is just so massive that some units certainly will look completely incompetent. Also, outside of a few SOF units and light infantry, there isn't a whole lot of emphasis placed on toughness. However, combat arms units are no frickin' joke. We have the best, most expensive training in the world and by far the best equipment. I would not want to be on the other team. Chances are I would be dead before I even saw an American soldier. Story 7. Another former US Army OPFOR soldier here. I spent 6 years doing this though, not 6 months. I worked in Germany, so I not only got to work with the US, but most of the European NATO forces in some capacity over the past 6 years. Most of my work was with mechanized forces, but I was light infantry by trade. It wasn't that often we got to do light infantry work, but I would do as many recon missions as I could to get out of the tin box that we had to run around in. Now keep in mind, I was there in the mid to late 90s, and things like experience have changed a lot since then, with all the deployments the military has seen over the years. Back then, we would primarily work with units stationed in Europe. They had a huge disadvantage. They were in our backyard. They didn't get field time like we did. We averaged 300 plus days a year in the field, so they were not as skilled as us. Most of the units in Europe didn't have much for training facilities, other than the once or twice a year they would come to work with us. Units in the US, I feel, would put up a little better fight. At times, we would work with special operations units, SOF, Rangers, and such, and as you would expect, there was a night and day difference. They had better equipment, were better motivated, and had larger training budgets. This made them a tougher fight, but I'll leave it at that. A lot of the time, the political side of things would step in. This would happen when other people may be watching, or things would generally happen remotely because we were doing a little too good. I lost count how many times a general would step in and cancel an artillery strike that I called in because it would take out too many of his people. At first, I would get upset, but later I realized that by denying my strike, they would get to continue fighting a little longer and get a bit more training out of it, rather than just having to sit on the sidelines and watch because I took them out right as they crossed the start line. As for other countries that I worked with, while we were in Germany, we didn't fight the Germans very often. We would train with them, and there were a couple units that would come out into the field with us, though. It was just rare that we would actually fight them. While they would come to our training facility, they would bring 2 units and fight each other, typically. Since they had to pay the US to train at our facility to include all our fuel, ammo, and such, they realized they could better spend their money by training 2 of their units at the same time by fighting each other. When Kosovo was going on, we did run a German unit that was deploying through the process, and they were shocked that they got wiped out so quickly. I'm talking we rendered an armored battalion combat ineffective in about 25 seconds from first contact. They then brought in their top armored battalion to fight us, and while they did a little better, they didn't stand much of a chance still. The Brits we would work with once a year usually. It was expensive to bring them to Germany, so it wasn't very often. They were pretty good. I would rate them a little better than the US forces that were stationed in Germany, and likely on par with that of US stationed US forces. Probably the country that we would train the most was the Dutch army. They were a trip. You could really see where the difference is with an all-volunteer military and one that has conscripts. We would like working with them as it was something different, and we would get a good laugh about the things they would do. We'll never forget when I was the track commander as we were on an attack. Here's this Dutch truck coming down the road. It stops, backs up a couple feet, stops again. Next thing I see is all the occupants jumping out and running for their lives. They just left the truck in the middle of the road. Story 8. While I cannot speak from experience, I'm an American, I can relay something my father mentioned to me a few years ago. He was a Marine during the conflict in Grenada, and he was also active during the First Gulf War. He has never gone into great detail about his combat history, and frankly, I wouldn't want him to have to rewalk those memories. But he did mention one time how you can see a man's fear before you see him. Kind of cryptic, I know, but that one statement says a lot. He mentioned how you could hear them yelling, and that the yells were not the confident kind. He meant that these men knew they were about to fight Americans with all their fancy toys and extreme training. They knew that the Marines were coming to wipe them out. My dad always told me that one of the greatest weapons of our military is the image that we conjure in the minds of our enemies. While it is one thing to fight someone who you feel is an equal or lesser match to you, it is a completely different scenario to fight someone who you truly feel is a monstrous force of war. I can't speak for the other branches strictly because I don't have a close personal relationship with someone who is enlisted, and I have never enlisted. However, I can tell you that my father and all of his Marine buddies are absolutely vicious if prodded into an aggressive situation. Story 9. I'm a sapper in the Australian Army, and I've spent a month living out bush performing enemy party, basically OP4. We wore different uniforms, usually Vietnam olive drab or desert cams, grew beards and lived like insurgents. so one does pick up the thought patterns of a soldier fighting a coalition army. Half the day was spent just burning time, reading, talking smack and politics, playing cards, eating rations, and then the rest was combat and cereals. So we would march out to a position and hit the soldier troop harbor at night, probing, trying to capture weapons and packs or being challenged and bumping them with a few rounds before withdrawing. The majority of the combat tasks were during the day. However, we'd perform ambushes and conduct prisoner wounded/surrendering serials. One thing that was surprising was how often soldiers, particularly officer cadets, would commit war crimes, clear violations of the laws of armed combat, most of them accidental and a few not. One example was I observed a scout, and then withdrew to the edge of a clearing until I had a visual on the rest of the section. I bumped a few rounds and then waited for them to advance with fire, while my partner moved around their rear. Once they were within 40 meters of my position, then I would display that I had surrendered, rifle raised above my head or hands up, and I would be shouting "Nicht schießen." Almost consistently, I was shot after they ceased fire by one of the section's members. Commonly, one would fire and the rest would open up, and twice I was clearly executed, close distance in verbal contact and then shot with blanks. This is training, but it was surprising. The chaos of a firefight would create friendly or enemy mentality. No gray zone emerged for wounded combatants or surrendering parties. Also, factoring in trigger-happy 18-year-olds in a purely training environment may account for this, but still, it was interesting. We also did civilian interactions, no weapons and us wearing Hawaiian shirts and jeans. 50% we'd be lit up, and 50% they would challenge and conduct prisoner handling. Story 10. I had the opportunity to be Op 4 pretend baddies for a Spec Ops raid one night recently. We all had basic roles to play and to make sure that the good guys got practice at typical scenarios, but we were allowed to do whatever we wanted within the confines of the role we were given. My role was to be a squirter from the main target building. When the raid rolled up, I was to fire off some rounds and bolt as fast as possible over a hilly area and take cover in an adjacent building. Then, when and if they came to my building, try to light up as many good guys as possible before being shot. The blacked out Hummers roll up and I unload my rounds. After emptying a mag, I bolt for the second building. I'm not usually a nervous type of person, but it was either the sprint or the fact that those Hummers were really terrifying. But my heart rate didn't slow down after I'd stopped running. I remember thinking two things. First, how it was strange I was so scared, since I knew it was a simulation and this was a war game, and second, that I knew for a fact that I was going to die. I was outnumbered and outmatched. They had night vision and I was armed with a single AK. The sense of dread was really vivid, and I remember imagining noises and sights, and kept playing out an operator sneaking up behind me in my mind. The next surprising thing was that when they rolled up to my building, they weren't sneaky or silent as I imagined in books. Yet they also weren't yelling at each other like I'd learned from cop shows when they clear rooms. They were all talking to each other in calm voices and using first names, relaying information about the current situation in a methodical manner. I had left a light on at one corner of the building in hopes that I could spring a trap from the other. I turned the corner and unloaded a mag as fast as possible at the parked Hummer, barely aiming. All I could think about is the 10 to 20 guns all silently hunting for the slightest movement. Then, and I'll never forget this, I saw the most eerie sight imaginable. A red dot bigger than I'd pictured or ever seen at the range, racing across the sand toward me. As I threw in a new mag and turned the other direction to check my 6, I had just enough time to catch the second red dot repeating the first's move as if they were synchronized divers. I've never been more impressed and mortified in my life. The next thing I felt was pretty surreal. In short, I was hit in the chest and in the back at the exact same moment by two operators rounding the sides of the building. I was in a corner. As I retreated from one side of the building to the other, fearing the first shooter, I ran directly into his counterpart. Their bullets, simunition, contacted me at approximately the same place on my chest and my back. I listened to them clear the inside of the building. Those same cool, methodical voices, first names, nothing like what I had imagined. Then they searched my dead body. They began to take off my mask, paintball-type contraption, to ID my face, and the plastic was cutting into my eyebrow, so I reached up to help them to take it off without hurting me. One of the operators standing watch over me almost shot me, and politely asked me to inform them verbally of any other movements I would make. Anyway, to wrap this long story up, afterwards I met all the guys that were on the op. There were about 20, and they were all smart as hell. Many of them had gone to college and enlisted anyway, in order to join Spec Ops. Several of them spoke multiple languages, and none of them were what I had imagined. They were all humble and completely professional. They were also so thankful for us volunteers that they lit up. Basically, I don't know how it would feel to fight against US soldiers with real ammo, and it made me pray I never will. It seemed pointless. Disclaimers. These guys weren't practicing with air support that night. It would have been even more terrifying with that on my mind. Also, a friend of mine who is an operator wasn't sure why they would have red dots equipped while using NVGs. I have no idea, I just know what I saw. Maybe it was an intimidation factor, I don't know, it almost made me crap myself. This was a great write-up about why it would be terrifying. OP kinda has a talent for writing, I can't lie. I felt like I was there. Seeing those red dots pan in the same way and then getting shot in the front and back at the same time, that's crazy. It's true, the level of training these guys have is really impressive. Story 11. Former active army infantry here. Not sure how I'd feel if I met someone who told me they were former JAM. There were dozens of armed groups fighting against each other and fighting the coalition forces at the same time. My first deployment, it was mostly the Mahdi army. On one hand, a lot of them were poor, unemployed kids with zero prospects for employment or education. The only possible option for them was to grab a rifle and show up with the rest of the ski masks, and run into coaxial machine gun fire, or dig a hole for $20 and get blown apart by an Apache. So I have some empathy for the plight of the poor, uneducated, unemployed youth who took up arms to fight the imperialist stormtrooper invaders. Sure, yeah, if Red Dawn happened, I'd be in the woods with the Wolverines too, roger that. On the other hand, kidnappings, torture, execution, burning the people out of their homes, corruption of the police force, the 3 dead preteens we found kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, the 10-year-old kid shot in the head right in front of me by a sniper, the 90-plus civilian murder victims we found just in the first month of our combat tour, the kid whose tongue they cut out because he liked to chat with us when we rolled by his neighborhood, the fact that Muqtada al-Sadr is now an officially recognized member of the Iraqi government. So yeah, I can't do it. I can't forgive them.